Hi, my name is Mark Duehmig, President of Encompass Multimedia Incorporated. Over the last 14 years, I've been in charge of a lot of different productions, documentaries, sales videos, training videos, even trade show support. All the kinds of things that a typical business production will do. What we want to do in this video is to cover some of the basics of choosing your equipment, setting up your workspace, shooting itself in the field, and then the post-production aspects. So sit back, relax, and enjoy, and hopefully you will find this as informative as we hope it to be. One of the first decisions you'll have to make is to decide whether you want to do the production yourself or if you want to hire a production company to do it for you. There are pros and cons to each way, and as we go through the different steps of the production process, we'll help you make that decision. One of the benefits of having a production company do it for you is that they have the equipment, they have the knowledge, and the production can probably be done more quickly, and you are more likely to have a very professional result. However, that comes at a very significant price. Video productions are expensive, and as you see what the cost of the equipment is and the time involved, I think you'll understand why. Now, I'm not trying to talk you out of doing it yourself. There's a lot of advantages to making the investment in the equipment, the time, and the skills, because your second and your third and your fourth productions will get less and less expensive as you go. The items that we discuss in this video will help you whether or not you hire a production company or choose to do it yourself. Let's proceed under the idea that you're going to tackle this job yourself. One of the first things you have to decide is, where are you going to set up a studio? Now, a studio doesn't require a lot of space. If you're going to go into business for yourself or be an in-house production company for a larger organization, all you need is a few square feet for a computer and some equipment storage. There's a possibility that you'll need some space to shoot in a studio environment, but you'll only need that occasionally, so consider whether or not you might be able to borrow a friend's garage space or use a production area of your company. It doesn't take a lot of space, and each time it's going to vary depending on what you need, so it's not anything that you necessarily need to plan for in your permanent office environment. Designing a studio really depends on the resources that you have. But let's start with your best case scenario. Let's say you had all the room in the world to work with. Lay out on paper what it is that you'd like to have. For instance, you'll need an editing bay with room for a computer and monitors and decks. Do you need two by chance, or is one enough? When we were designing this studio, we knew that we were going to work with a lot of narrators, so we built in a small sound booth adjacent to the main editing station. Behind me, you can also see that we've got a lot of equipment that we saved some space with by putting it in racks. So a lot of our hard drive storage and our video decks are all mounted in a vertical rack to save space. So lay out what you'd like to have and what you think you need. This may also include a 10 by 20 area that you can set up with backdrops for interviews and that sort of thing, but it depends on what kind of productions you're going to do. Once you've got it laid out, then compare that to the resources that you have. If you're working in an in-house department of a company, you may only be assigned one small office. But if you can, work out a storage area. Negotiate another small space that you can occasionally put a backdrop and work from when you need that extra space. Because as you accumulate equipment, you'll soon run out of space in a small office. Keep in mind when you're designing your office, even if you have all the space in the world, there are a few different limitations in the equipment that may want to influence where you arrange things. For instance, if you keep all of your hard drive and decks on a vertical storage rack, cable considerations, cable lengths will require you to keep that vertical rack near the editing equipment and the CPU itself. Also, when choosing a desk, consider a U-shaped desk or one that's specifically designed for editing. You've got a lot of different monitors and things that you want to keep within arm's reach because you're often using them. Also, you want to keep your speakers set so that you will form a triangle with those speakers. We'll get to choosing which speakers you want later, but right now just consider that you need the space to lay everything out properly. And a good work surface is a good place to start. One other consideration when you're designing your workspace is lighting. You're going to be working with a large screen monitors, hopefully, over a large course of the day. When we're shooting this video, we've got lights on us that are not necessarily representative of what I would normally be editing with. So when I built the lights in this studio, we put them on dimmers. And when I'm going to be editing for a long period of time, I dim the lights down in the studio so that I don't have a lot of glare off my screens and off the other work surfaces. Most studios are going to be fairly dim while you're doing the editing. Once you've chosen most of the components of your image acquisition, your video and your audio and your lighting, now it's time to think about what you're going to use for the editing. This is a big decision because once you've chosen a path, you have hardware, software, backup, electrical supply, a lot of different components to keep track of and to think about. Let's start with editing platforms. You really have two major choices, Macintosh and Windows platform. They both have very capable software and they're both very capable platforms to edit on. They have full suites of software that you can use, and the differences between them nowadays are pretty minor. I personally have chosen the Macintosh platform for the editing suites here at Encompass Multimedia, but most of what I've got to say is going to be relative to either of the platforms. So we work with Macintosh here, and for the Macintosh I use the Final Cut Pro editing suite. If you're on Windows and you're looking for a professional editing package, you might consider Adobe Premiere. Or on both platforms, there's the Avid editing solution as well. Now, Final Cut Pro from Apple, just like Adobe Premiere from Adobe, all have both the editing package and several other component bits of software that go along with them. For example, here on the Macintosh, I have an editing program brought up, and I can use multiple clips and combine audio and graphics and still photos however I need to create the final video product. Using other applications that might be available either as an entire package, like the Final Cut Pro editing suite or Adobe's editing tools, you can get more utility out of the software using tools like LiveType, where you're letting a specified program and perhaps even templates do a lot of the work for you. I took just 2 seconds here, created a template for Show Me How Video, and I've got a very nice looking professional transition or title done for me with very little effort on my part. So either platform's got some great tools, but you want to consider the entire editing package, not just the compositing package. Now, when I speak of compositing, what am I talking about? Generally, there is one main program that all these other titling tools and motion tools and sort of thing work to provide information for. Okay? Again, no matter which platform you use, you have another decision to make, and that is your storage. Your video in the DV format is being recorded at 3.6 megs a second. That translates to about 13.5 gigabytes per hour of video. So if you're going to do a 1-hour sales video, which I hope you don't, that's 13 gigabytes of raw material at least, probably closer to 2 hours worth of raw material, so that's 26 gigabytes. You're going to add some other photos and maybe some animation and titles. That's going to require a few more gigabytes, and then you're going to want to output the final 1-hour video, another 13 gigabytes. So for a single 1-hour production, you very well may need 40 to 50 gigabytes just for that production. So what does that mean for your storage? Well, first of all, you need to make sure that your hard drives are fast enough to be able to record that 3.6 megabyte per second for an extended period of time while you capture and play the video. Another consideration is backing up the videos. A RAID system, capital R-A-I-D, allows for redundancy among drives. If you're working on a very time-sensitive or very important project, dividing up your project among our set of RAID drives helps guarantee that if you had a catastrophic failure in any one of those drives, you can recover the entire project from the remaining drives. Now that's a hardware issue that you need to talk to a professional about and decide whether or not that cost is worth it to you. But one of the simplest solutions may be simply either FireWire external drives or USB 2 external drives. Both of them work about the same speed, and provide very fast and very affordable storage solutions. At any one time on this editing station, I have about 2 terabytes or 2,000 gigabytes of hard drive space reserved for the different productions I'm working on. That leaves enough space for several projects to be worked on at once, plus maintaining some libraries of sound material, still photographs, and clips that I use over and over again. But whether or not that's practical for you depends on what kind of productions you do. Finally, once you're done with your productions or throughout the course of your productions, you need to think about how to back up and archive this material. That's for 2 reasons. First of all, if the material on your hard drive dies, you're out of luck. The material on the hard drive is worth far more than the drives itself. And second of all, is that if you stay in the business for 10 or 15 years, you're not going to want to keep every production that you work on. You're going to need to be able to archive those, put them away somewhere safe, and come back and get them as needed. Now, I actually started using a tape drive a few years ago. That works okay, but at about 30 or 40 gigabytes per tape, it still took a stack of over 20 tapes to back up my working system. That got to be financially very expensive because the tapes are very expensive and it took forever to do. Now what I'm doing for my simple and frequent backups is buying 500 gigabyte drives and copying projects onto those and then sticking them in a safe. But it's a unique problem in that what we're working on as video producers is a very, very big data hog. So there's just a few thoughts for you to work with, but you're going to have to budget in some storage space for every project. Now, when you're putting together the tools to your editing suite, one of the components that you got to make sure that you don't miss is an NTSC monitor. Now, it's not a computer monitor, nor is it just a television. It's really a calibrated tool that's a double check to your video output. Are you sure that your whites aren't too bright? Are you sure that your reds aren't bleeding? And when you are editing the package on your computer, you can get live feedback of what the viewer is going to see. Now, this is a slightly older version. It's still a CRT, a cathode ray tube. Nowadays, when you go to buy a NTSC monitor, they're going to be a flat panel, which are even better on saving space. But an NTSC monitor is an important part of a professional's tool chest. All right, another tool for your tool chest is your speakers. Now, the speakers that come with your computer are multimedia speakers. They're pretty cheap. And they have been corrected to make up for their own deficiencies, usually not a lot of bass, that sort of thing. In short, they're not really up to the task of being good audio monitors for editing videos. And the reason, as I said before, when you're picking your audio equipment, your audio is very, very important to the production. It needs to be clear. You need to be able to hear the little background things that are going to be distracting on your customer's television set or DVD player, however it is. So what you need to invest in is a set of real studio monitors. And that's what they'll be called in say a catalog would be studio monitors. Now, they are generally very high quality and sort of like your NTSC monitor, they're balanced. They're the best case scenario, and they're going to allow you to double check what it is that you're editing and make sure that you're not leaving things out or putting something in that you didn't know. Now, when you go to set these up, they should be on either side of your workstation, an equal distance apart and about head height. And that way you and the speakers will form a small triangle. Now, this is just a little side note when you're out doing your hardware shopping. The nice salesperson might say, well, what kind of capture card do you want? And I wanted to answer that question before it confuses you. When you're working with DV format, you really don't need a capture card at all. A capture card is something that converts a video signal to something that your computer can use. But one of the beauties of the DV video format is that the video is actually recorded to tape in the right format for your computer to use. So you're just going to use an ordinary FireWire connection to get the video from the tape onto your computer. Another name for FireWire is IEEE 1394. That's the official name. But if you ask someone for FireWire cables, they'll know what you're talking about. And that's a great segue into the next question, which is how do you get the video from your camera onto your computer? Well, it's a trick question because we don't really want to get the video from our camera into the computer. We want to use an alternate method. Your camera is great at recording, but it doesn't make a very good deck. It makes an okay backup deck because you can get the video from your camera onto your computer, onto your hard drive. But what would be better is, when you're out shopping for equipment, is that you budget for a real DV deck. Now, this is the one that I use, and there's a bunch of them out there. What is important is that the DV deck has a smoother, more reliable mechanism, and that you're not wearing out the drive mechanism in your camera, because that's not really what the camera is made for. And you know, if you have edited several hours of video, you're going to put some serious time and mileage on that deck. So if you're going to do this professionally, this is a necessary item for you to get, a video deck that you can take the tapes from the camera, put them in this, and then copy it from here onto the hard drive. Now, the actual mechanics of that capturing, we'll talk about later, but put that on your list. When you're considering about some of the items that you can have to save you headaches and gray hairs later, consider a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply for your computer and your hard drives. There's a lot of things that a UPS will do in addition to saving your bacon if the power goes out, which is possible. It, for instance, smooths out the electricity, it helps smooth out spikes and brownouts and that sort of thing. And the bigger the building you're in and the older the company, that is some things that can hurt the computer equipment that you're using. So consider, for the investment that you're making, putting an extra few $100s in to a uninterruptible power supply. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what you might need out in the field or when you're shooting a project to make sure that you've collected the audio properly and that you're getting the best audio recording that you can. Well, that's great when you're out in the field and you're actually shooting video, but what happens if you need some other audio recordings, for instance, narration to a documentary, or want to record someone's music for an original music score to the video? If you have the space, and if this is going to be a big part of the projects you use, you might consider a sound booth. Now, not everyone's got the need for a sound booth in their studio, but if you have the space, and it doesn't take much, then they're pretty easy to build. For this one, we framed up a space that we thought would be adequate. We put in a window that we got from a second-hand building supply store, and then coated the inside with egg crate foam. Now, it's tempting to look through audio supply catalogs and look at the cost of real acoustic dampening foam, and you might be turned off by that. But it doesn't have to be that specialized, and I suggest you do some searches on the internet for some less expensive alternatives. And then once you've got this, make sure that the walls are well insulated with ordinary fiberglass insulation, and you've got a good sound booth. Now, also in here, I've put a microphone on an arm so it'll adjust to anyone's height, either sitting or standing, and I've got a popper stopper, which helps balance out some of the sound, the sharp P's and T's. I also have a mixer. This makes it a little fancier than most people need, so that I can be running the sound equipment in there on the other side, and I can be monitoring the person speaking as well as talk to them through a microphone, so you're not yelling through the soundproof sound booth. But if you have the space for a sound booth, it's a great addition to a studio. When discussing what equipment you'll need, of course, one of the first things that comes to mind will be cameras. Now, this isn't going to be your last purchase decision, but it's probably the first on your mind. So let's talk about it now. You've got a wide range of things to choose from. We're going to work in the DV format, stands for digital video. I don't want you to confuse the DV format of video with the generic term digital video. Using the generic term digital video means that the video that you're recording is being captured in a digital format on tape so that you can edit it later without any generational loss. We are using that type, but specifically there is a line of cameras that use the DV encoding. We'll talk about those encoding methods later, but right now when you go on your shopping spree, you'll see that most of the cameras in the mid-price range will be in the DV format. Now we're going to talk specifically about the prosumer level cameras. A single CCD camera won't capture nearly the color that a 3 CCD camera will in that prosumer range. A 3 CCD camera takes the light and splits it up between the 3 primary colors, red, green, and blue, and each chip gets its own color. Now what this means is generally a prosumer camera is going to have much richer color than a single CCD camera will. And this is especially true after you've edited. Okay, in this prosumer range of cameras, we've got quite a few choices as well. I've chosen to give a few examples here from Canon because they make a wide variety of capabilities in their different formats. Now, it's important to note that between these two cameras, they actually have the same image processors. The difference being is what you can do with the cameras with accessories and lenses. So we'll talk about that in a second. In one range of camera is the GL1. Now this has since been replaced by the GL2, but it's generally the same camera. It has many of the same recording formats as you would find in the sub $1,000 range, but it also has the ability to do manual adjustments as well. These manual adjustments are very important because as you increase your quality of shooting and your skill of shooting, you're going to want to shoot more and more in total manual mode. On the other side of the coin is the XL1, also since been upgraded to the XL2, but generally very similar cameras. The most significant difference between the XL1 and many of the other prosumer cameras out there is its ability to change lenses. This is the lens that the XL1 came with. It's a 16 times lens, reasonable quality, has an image stabilizer, which is good on those rare occasions when you should shoot without a tripod. But if you need a wider angle lens for shooting indoors or following people around, that is available too. Instead of a 16 times, you've got a 3 times lens. And it's very useful to be able to switch between these. Now, in addition to these two standard lenses, Canon also makes a separate, much higher quality lens, which you can see here, that's also a 16 times lens and also has a very sharp focusing ability. So if quality is really what you want to pursue, then making an investment into a higher quality lens is generally worth the price. Now, I've also added to this camera what's called a matte box. And the matte box does two things. It usually has this item, which is called a French flag, to reduce some glare of the lights around it. And the box itself helps to reduce that glare as well. But you also have the ability to drop in colored mattes or diffusers to adjust the picture. Perhaps you want to make it look a little bit more like sunset, where you can get a partial gradiated filter to drop in there and color the sky more orange while keeping things in the lower part of the picture clear. Playing with mattes and filters is a whole other subject in itself, but this is the kind of things that you can do with a larger, more capable camera. One of the other choices you'll have when you're making your camera buying decision is how you actually want to record the video. The cameras have a built-in mechanism to record the video on tape, and that works terrific. However, some new technology has come out to actually allow you to record the video directly to a hard drive. Now, the benefit of that is when you are back in your studio ready to edit, you can take the hard drive off the camera, slide it right in your editing bay, and your video is all ready to go. There's no transfer process that we'll talk about later in editing. But that's just one more thing to consider. It's an extra expense, and it's not perhaps a perfected technology yet, but it's getting very close. Something to consider. One of the other things I'd like to discuss is the overall resolution. There are a lot of good quality and reasonably priced high definition cameras out there for sale right now. There are several different reasons why I want to keep the topics of this video on standard definition. That's your normal NTSC, what you get over the airwaves television. High definition is a great technology, and there's no reason in the world technically why you can't pursue the high definition path. But you have to ask yourself, first of all, is there really a reason for your clients to want it? I personally have never been asked for a high definition product. One of the reasons is it's very hard to do anything with the final product. If you're going to be on broadcast, that's terrific. But if you're going to display that video at a trade show or in a conference room or pass them out to clients perhaps, you have to consider the fact that the clients probably don't have high definition equipment readily available. Or if they want to, that's an added expense for the client to have to pursue. So we're going to keep this discussion to standard definition because there's still a lot of life in standard definition, and most of the shooting principles and editing principles we're going to discuss will pertain to both of them anyhow. Now, one other consideration when you're buying cameras is to watch out for the cameras that actually record the video on DVD. These don't record the video in DV format, but rather in MPEG-2 format. And the important thing about that is that when MPEG compresses a video, it compresses it by throwing away a lot of the information. And that's going to hurt you when it comes time to edit the video. Whereas with a digital video format, each frame is compressed individually as best it can be without losing a lot of the quality. So while watching from a DVD may look good, you're going to want to edit this, and that's where it'll come back to bite you. Alright, so now you've selected your camera. Another reason to select cameras first is that your next decision, tripods, will be based on which camera you choose. For instance, you'll choose a different tripod with a 6-pound camera than you will with a 10-pound camera. Tripods are definitely not an area to skimp on. Whenever your camera pans or moves with the action, you're really going to hope that you've paid for a good tripod and tripod head. Now, what we have here is a professional version, and believe me, you can spend a lot of money on a tripod, sometimes as much as the camera. You probably don't need quite that level, and I also think that this is a good place to try the used markets on the internet to find some good quality equipment that someone else has moved away from. Most good quality tripods will have 2 or 3 specific features that you'll want. One of the features that a professional tripod will have is a ball and head system. Now, the balls will come in 75 and 100 millimeter sizes, but generally the size of the tripod will be dictated when you size it appropriately with your camera. The benefit of this is no matter how you set your tripod up, you have a little bubble level that you can see and a threaded knob on the bottom. When you loosen that knob, you can adjust the angle of the camera anywhere you want to make sure that that bubble is perfectly straight, and now you're going to have a nice straight pan no matter where you move the camera. This camera also has a plate system for moving the camera on and off the tripod. Now, it's a little busy because we have the matte box on it as well, but the plate is actually this device down here. You permanently mount the camera to that plate, leave it on there generally, and then just slide it back on the tripod when you need it to be so. Now let's talk about the legs of the tripod. The legs of the tripod, of course, where the stability comes from. You have a couple decisions to make when you're deciding what kind of structure to purchase, and often the legs of the tripod are purchased separately than the head. Just something to think about to make sure that when you order a tripod, you are getting the head as well. One of the things to consider when you're choosing your tripod is, are you going to be carrying the tripod a lot? If you are, you might look into carbon fiber legs as opposed to the aluminum. Carbon fiber is very strong and very light, but you'll pay for that convenience. These are aluminum legs, and this is also called a single stage tripod because it has one point that you can raise and lower the tripods from. They come in second and third stage tripods as well. The feet of the tripod are also another consideration. Some of them come with permanent attached spiked feet that can hurt a carpet or hardwood floor if you're going to do some shooting inside. So in that case, you're going to want to make sure you have some sort of spreader to put underneath the feet. Generally the spreader will come with the tripod, but you may want to ask. The spreader also allows for some stability and rigidity to the legs since each of them moves independently. You can also get a device like this which allows the camera tripod to be moved easily around on the floor. Now, this is for convenience of shooting if you're going to do a lot of different angles and takes. But don't confuse this with a dolly that can actually handle the movement of the camera while you're moving around. The wheels on this are hard and they're going to pick up every little bump and jiggle. So this is not suitable for doing dolly shots, they're called. This is only for when the camera's not rolling, moving it to the next location. Okay, now let's talk about your audio decisions. Now, they call this a video production, but make no mistake, The audio is one of the most important parts of this production. Without the audio, you're not conveying anything. And if you do a bad job of it, it's very distracting. So this is an area that you really shouldn't skimp on, and you need to make the right decisions for audio. Now there's three main ways of getting the audio from the scene onto the recording device. The first is the one that everyone's most familiar with because they're so visible. It's the on-camera microphone. Generally, there's one included with every camera, and it's tempting to record with this. However, it's a very wide-angle shotgun microphone, meaning that it's going to record everything on that half of the camera. So car noises, birds tweeting, trucks going by, someone tapping their pencil off camera is going to show up and be heard on this microphone. Also, if the talent who's speaking moves to or from the camera or turns their head, all of that is going to affect the quality of the audio. So generally, this can be used as a backup, but do not plan on making this your primary source of audio recording. The second source, and my favorite, is the wireless lavalier microphone. I'm wearing a small microphone under my vest right now. Then the wire leads to a small transmitter clipped to my belt. Now they have wired versions of these too, but the wireless technology that is being employed is generally pretty darn good and gives the production flexibility they need to keep moving around and do what they need to do without worrying about tripping over wires. Now these little lavaliers are not perfect in that you can get pops and hisses and some static on the recording. The newest generations of these microphones have a recording device inside that can actually record what the person is saying as well as transmit it to the camera. So when you get back to the editing phase, if you do hear pops and hisses that were missed during the recording, you still have a perfect recording that you can pull off and use later. The third type of microphone is usually out of sight. It's called the boom mic. The boom mic is a shotgun microphone that is held by a sound man off stage and is pointed at the talent, but you need to keep it out of the field of view. Now, bring that back here a second. What the boom mic really is a very tightly directional shotgun microphone. Unlike this one, which is a very wide pattern, this one is very narrow. So the sound man keeps it off the camera as close as possible and pointed right at the person who's speaking or whatever the sound is that you're recording. But you need to keep it out of the field of view. And it can be above or below the camera's field of vision. Okay, now how about shopping for lighting? Another very important part, because almost every scene is going to need some sort of lighting assistance. We'll get into how to do that best shortly, but for now let's talk about the different kinds of studio lights you can get to help with the close-up shots. There are three main kinds of lights that we can work with. First is the on-camera light. Now this is a slightly fancier version than you might see at a consumer electronics store. There are two real problems with the on-camera light. One is the light comes directly at the person's face and it can kind of make a flat image, which isn't necessarily very flattering. So the on-camera light is used when there may not be enough room to set up any other lights. You're in a hurry, you just kind of have to, as they say, run and gun. It's used for ENG, electronic news gathering, is where you'll see these a lot. Or where there's no other electricity for any other types of lighting, you can use this. Now it'll plug into 110 if you're in a studio, but generally you'll use it when there's nothing else available and has to come with a battery pack because it uses a lot of juice. And even with a fairly heavy pack like this, you're going to be looking at only 25 minutes to half an hour of use. Now when you're choosing a studio light, there are two main considerations: the quality of the light and the brightness of the light. The brightness of the light can be adjusted by the brightness of the bulb and of course the closeness of the light to the subject. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later in the lighting section of production. But the other factor that I mentioned is called quality. And quality sort of refers to the harshness of a light. So when you have a light that has a bare bulb, it's going to be a very harsh quality of light and will produce harsh, sharp shadows. This is a small version of what we call a softbox. Because of this screen in front of it, the light is diffused over this entire area and therefore has a very soft quality of light. We'll talk about the uses of these lights in a little bit later, but this is primarily used for scenes when you're lighting a person, like for an interview, and this is used when you're lighting a broader area and need more direct light, like for instance a stage or a larger factory floor where you might be doing some shooting. This type of light, the softbox, is what I'm being lit with right now. To help illustrate the difference in quality of lights, I've set up my sailorman here and lit him with a very soft quality of light, a softbox that we spoke about earlier. The white diffuser on the front of the light makes a light source that's very large. And when you have that, it allows the light to wrap around the object instead of only lighting from one direction. And because it falls off gradually, it can be very flattering when you're working on a human figure. But if you're looking for a large area that's far away, then you might want a harsher light. Let's show that. Okay, we're back with a harsh light. That's the harsh quality of light. This light is the same distance as our softbox was, but now it's not being diffused and it's all coming from a single point. Now, when that happens, that means that all of the light rays are coming from a single point too. And the result is that they're not bending around the object. If it doesn't hit, and it creates a very sharp edge, a very sharp shadow. You'll also notice that harshness and the brightness of light so close to me is making me squint. And that's going to be the same thing that happens with any other subject that you might be interviewing, and another good reason to use softboxes when you're working with human subjects. We've gone over quite a list of different equipment that you're probably going to need, or at least consider if you're going to need. But the bill is going to keep adding up because there's a lot of little things that you may want too. For instance, there's an object called a camera crane that goes under very different trade names, but it's designed to be able to lift the camera at varying heights and keep the camera moving at the same direction, pointing at the same thing, no matter how you turn it. It can be great for fade-ins and transitions, opening sequences, that sort of thing. But is it really needed? Not necessarily unless you need it for a particular shot. So that's something that you might want to plan for next year or down the road. Another object that you might need a lot of is called gaffer's tape. Now, gaffer's tape is more expensive than the stuff that you're going to find in the grocery store, but it's worth every cent. You use it to mark where the talent's going to stand, or tape up a roll of bundled wires so they don't droop into the scene, or so that people don't trip over wires. And when you pull it up, there's no sticky residue left, and it works every time. Now, you're getting your grocery list together of all the different equipment pieces that you need. Something that you shouldn't leave out, and again, it's going to be an investment, are cases to protect your equipment for when you're moving it. Now, if you work out of the studio or within the office all the time, you probably aren't going to need a whole lot of protection for your gear because it won't really leave your hand. But as soon as you start throwing it into the back of your car to go to a location, or climb on an airplane and put it in an overhead compartment, or even worse, check it, you're going to want to invest in some gear that in itself will protect your other gear. Now, I've got three different styles of cases here. This soft case is kind of generic. I call it a gaffer's bag, and I put all kinds of different things in it that I might need, like a microphone and headphones and extra batteries and tapes. And generally, I'll carry this one with me. This one is more specialized. It's also a soft case, but it's designed specifically to hold the XL1 video camera. So it has all the bumps necessary to protect it tightly and carefully without stressing any individual item like the shotgun microphone. So this is a case bought specifically for another piece of equipment. And finally, the venerable Pelican case. There's a couple different versions of this, but when you have a large set of equipment that you need to check and hand over to someone else's care, this is a great tool to do it with. Now, you can get this with either the pick and pluck foam, it's called, or you can get it with movable partitions. A little depends on whether or not you're going to customize this box for a specific set of gear, in which case the pick and pluck would probably be the best choice. Or if you're going to use it to carry different equipment on every transport, then the movable foam walls might be the better choice for you. One little caveat about these larger cases is that the airlines have a 50-pound weight limit for checking your gear. I don't really know what this one weighs, but it doesn't take a lot of gear to be more than 50 pounds. So you can't just fill this limitlessly full of gear and get away with it at the airlines, but it's still a very safe way to move your equipment around the country. When preparing for a shoot, You need to keep in mind the environmental conditions in which you're going to be shooting. If you're in the studio all the time, then you don't have much to worry about. But if you go outside into cold weather or rainy weather or dusty weather, you need to take care of your equipment. So some extra equipment that it's good to have with you are cleaning cloths. But keep in mind these are real lens cloths and not a terry cloth towel. You want to be very careful with what touches your lenses. And also a can of compressed air. Compressed air is good at getting dust out of the nooks and crannies of the exterior of the camera. But you don't want to use this on the lens itself, and you never ever want to use it on the CCD, the actual imaging sensor on the inside of when you take the lens off, because it can leave a residue behind that can damage the CCD. This camera's seen some wear and tear. The last shoot it was in the crawl space of a house, and it's gotten pretty dirty. In fact, it's dirty enough that I'll probably send it in for some professional cleaning because it's also been in the deserts of Africa and the Middle East. So there is some sand and nooks and crannies that a can of compressed air won't get out. But some things to watch out for when you're shooting with a camera like this is, especially in a dusty environment, never change your lenses out in the open if you can avoid that. The lens protects the CCD inside the camera from getting dirty. So when you have to change lenses, do so in an environment where there's very little air moving around, inside a building, inside a car, or at the very least behind a windbreak of some sort. That'll save you a lot of grief later if you have to try to clean your CCD. Another environmental consideration to keep in mind is temperature. You need to give your gear time to acclimate when you go from one temperature extreme to the other. For instance, it's very cold outside today, so if I was moving my gear from the outside into a warm environment, I need to wait a while before I take off the lens caps, or there's going to be moisture condensating on the surface of the lens. Now, yes, this will wipe away, but it's going to leave streaks, and even so, it needs to be a little while before you record, or it's just going to fog up again. Cameras can be covered to protect them from the rain, although you have to think about all the rest of the electrical equipment that's going to be out there with you. When it's cold, cold weather will zap battery strength very quickly. Putting a rain cover over or something else to protect it from the wind will help. Even consider using one of those chemical hand warmers to keep the battery itself warm. And keep all the rest of your batteries somewhere close to your body and not just in the equipment case out in the cold themselves. Let's start the production segment by talking about the script. By script, I don't necessarily mean a word-for-word description of what the talent is going to say. Don't forget, in many scenes you won't even have talent, but rather an outline of the video that's broken down into subject matter, into descriptions of the shot scenes, and yes, any particular verbiage that you need your talent to say. Every production needs to have a script, no matter how simple it is. It's the roadmap that you'll follow, and when you're done shooting the script, you'll know that your production is done. Without a script, then you're going to shoot a lot of extra footage that you probably don't need, and you'll find yourself in the editing bay trying to assemble the story that you have in your head, and you'll realize that you really needed a couple more shots. So working with a script is an absolute necessity. There are two ways to actually write the script. One is to use just an ordinary word processing program, and you'll find some outlines and samples of scripts on the internet. The other way is to actually get a script writing program. If you're going to use a lot of scripts in your business, then this may be a good way to go. But if not, if you're just getting started, you can get by just fine with a word processing program. One final note about scripts. When you're budgeting for your project, and this is whether you're working for yourself or an in-house production, make sure you budget time and money to write the script. It's that important, and you don't want to shortchange yourself when you put that many hours into getting it right. Also, one second. I need to check my script. Teleprompters. I also want to discuss briefly teleprompters. You see, once you've got the script down, well, you also may need to enter that information into a teleprompter. Thanks, Steve. Now let's talk about how to use a teleprompter. I'm using one right now, but you as the viewer can't tell that because I'm looking right at the lens. The teleprompter takes the image and reflects it on the glass so that the viewer, me, can read the text right as it needs to, but it's not visible to the camera lens. Now, you'll probably need to use a program like a teleprompter software or a PowerPoint type presentation program that allows you to reverse the text on the screen, because the way the reflection comes up off the glass, it'll be backwards if you don't first reverse it. And then you wire it through a laptop, something that you can type the script into. It's kind of a complicated system at times. You can also use the poor man's teleprompters we talked about before, but if you have a little bit of money and if you use talking heads a lot, it could be a great use of money. Audio, probably the most overlooked component in a video production process. Most of the information is communicated verbally through the audio. The video really only helps back up what you hear. So let's talk about how the best way to get good audio onto your production. We are transmitting my voice through a wireless microphone. Now, it doesn't matter how good of equipment that you have if there's not somebody there behind the camera with a pair of headphones on. Because when you get back and start editing this tape, and you find out afterwards that every movement of my jacket has caused audio problems, there's nothing you can do for that video except reshoot it. And that's a heck of a time to find out. So, number one rule, always monitor your audio. Ambient noise is another factor you need to be aware of. Sometimes you have control of it and sometimes you don't. Things like cars and people and appliances, even computers, are something we're dealing with here during this shoot. That's just from the hum of the hard drives. You do what you can to avoid it, and sometimes you can reduce the squelch in microphones that limits the overall level of sensitivity and can help mitigate that. Overmodulation is another thing to watch out for. This occurs when either an amplifier or microphone is turned up too loudly, or there's a background noise like a pounding hammer that causes way too much sound energy to reach the camera. This is an example of overmodulation. How would you like to try to fix this in post-production? There's really only two ways to avoid this, and that is to follow rule number one and monitor the sound with a pair of headphones, and two, keep an eye on a sound level meter if your camera has one. Err on the side of caution when it comes to sound level. It's easier to boost low audio than it is to try to fix overmodulation. General noises like hisses and pops are also common in a recording. This can be from a microphone being too close to a person's mouth to possible interference from a cell phone on the wireless microphone. Again, monitoring the recording will help you avoid this. If you're getting what's called explosive letters, P's and T's, that are coming across as pops, try moving the microphone further away from the talent's mouth. Also, if your budget allows, consider having a sound person. This is someone really with an external recording device and generally a separate microphone on a boom pole that keeps the microphone just out of the view of the camera but records an entirely separate audio recording of your production. Now, you can still rely on camera recorded audio, but this is a great backup and in many cases is going to be superior to the audio that's being recorded on your camera. And it's a great way just to have a backup. So, don't forget, your audio is the most important part of your video production. And the number one rule is, always monitor your audio with a good set of headphones. And don't underestimate the importance of audio. Now, let's talk about lighting. Chances are you've been using lighting for special effects since you were a kid. And now, let's talk about how to use them in your production to their fullest extent. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is the temperature of light. Now, this probably to a lot of people would mean color, but in the video production business we talk about temperature because all lights have a particular temperature at which they shine, for lack of a better word. A cooler light, for instance, is going to be more bluish, and a warmer light will be more yellow. Now, when you're shopping for your equipment, it may be tempting to go to the hardware store and buy some shop lights rather than video lights. However, the color of different lights are going to be just about impossible to match, and you'll really pay for that in your post-production process trying to get everything to look right. For example, If I turn on this light, you can see how much redder and how much warmer this light appears to me than it did with the lights from the studio. Now that we've covered the temperature of lights, let's discuss in more detail the quality of light. This refers to really the size, the pinpoint size or the very large area of the source of light. There are really two kinds of lights that really cover the whole gamut between the quality of light. We have the captain here being lit by a softbox, and it by its nature is a very soft light. And what that means is that because the light's coming from such a large area, that the light has a tendency to wrap gently around the object, and it'll soften. Even his harsh angles will be more softened by this light. Now, in contrast, I'm going to turn this one off and turn on a hard light. Now the captain is being lit by a very harsh quality of light. Now, one of the things right away you'll notice is the light is very intense, but that's because it's not being diffused over a larger area, and this brightness can be lessened by simply moving the light back. But the point that I want to show you now is how the shadows are different when your subject is being lit by a harsh quality of light. Instead of having light that wraps around the corners, it has now a very defined edge, and it creates a great deal of contrast between what's lit and what is not lit. Now, why is this important? If you're shooting an interview with someone who might be older and have some wrinkles or have other blemishes on their face, a soft light will smooth out some of these changes in their face and help hide them or make them less noticeable. However, if you're shooting someone who has a round head or perhaps they're a little heavier, using a harsh light can help define the nose, cheekbones, and chin and lessen the appearance of the roundness and give a little bit more shape to the body. So it's good to know which light to use on which occasion. If you only really have spotlights like we're using here, you can turn them into a softer light by using a diffusing material. Just make sure that whatever you use is not going to catch on fire because these lights get hot. If you have 2 or 3 different densities of this type of material in your light kit, you can have quite a lot of flexibility in how you light your subjects. In addition to using a diffuse material to soften the harsh light of a spot, you can also use an umbrella and shine the light up into the umbrella to create a much softer light, and that is a handy tool to have in your light kit as well. When you light your subject with a bright key light, you're going to notice that the shadows are going to be quite deep and possibly distracting, unless that's an effect that you're really going for. So to soften these shadows, then you want to use a fill light or a reflector. Let's talk about a reflector briefly. I'm going to use this light as an example. It's off, but it has a very large white reflective surface. Now look how the shadows on the captain's face and my face change when we're using a reflector as a fill. This side is still brightest and it still has good contrast in shadows for definition, but the fill allows the darkest areas to be brightened up a little bit so you don't lose detail. Now that we've got a lot of the basics of the lights and lighting out of the way, let's talk about one of the more commonly used and very useful lighting setups. Whenever you're going to light a specific subject, it's very frequent that you'll use a 3-point lighting setup. And what this consists of is a key, a fill, and a hair light, or a backlight. Let me define 3-point lighting. As I said before, there are 3 lights used in 3-point lighting. First of all is the key. Generally, this is the brightest light, and it's often a spot, but not necessarily. It's the one that is the primary lighting source for your subject. Second is the fill light. In an effort to reduce the harsh shadows, you will use a soft fill light, usually much dimmer than the key light, to just fill in some of the harsh shadows around the nose, under the eyes, under the chin, that sort of thing, and in an effort to make the lighting more flattering to the subject. Finally, we'll use the hair light. This is often a spotlight and is usually above and behind the subject and often directly opposite the key light. It shines down on the subject and lights up the hair and shoulder area of your subject to help define them and break them out from the background, however dark or light that may be. These 3 points should light your subject very well. You might have to play with the positioning of the lights to get your subject in the most flattering view. Now the hair light can be adjusted, sometimes using barn doors, to help limit the spill of the hair light so that it doesn't light up the rest of the surfaces or what I'm working with, but it concentrates the light just to my shoulders and the top of my head, where it's most useful. I've mentioned that when you're positioning the hair light, that you want it above and behind your subject. Well, that's tough to do with just a typical light stand because the light stand will go straight up and have the light on top. So a boom pole and arm is a great way to deal with that. It's a tripod that has an adjustable arm that gives you a great deal of flexibility with where that hair light goes and keeps it out of the camera's view. Now, when you've got a large light at the end of your boom arm, it's going to create quite a lot of cantilever and want to tip the tripod over. A little trick to dealing with that is to use a chair over 2 of the legs of the tripod. The best way is to use sandbag ballast on each of the legs, but if you don't have sandbags, if you've traveled somewhere by air, you certainly don't want to tote sandbags around with you. A chair works pretty well. You may have to put some weight on the seat, but that's still a good idea to deal with. What you can see when the camera pans back is shadows behind me from the key light and reflections on the wall from the glass table and from the TV on the wall. There's a few things we can do to improve the situation. First of all, I can use one of those diffusers to put over my key light, which is a spotlight, to soften the light that's hitting me, which reduces the contrast in the shadows behind me. Secondly, I can move to a different kind of table or put a tablecloth over this table, which reduce that reflection. Some of the other things you can do is to put a dark background behind me, perhaps a set of drapes or just plain a different part of the wall, which will absorb a lot of the contrast light behind me. Also, when possible, move your subject away from the wall so that the further I get from the wall, the softer those shadows will be. But also, I can use a 4th light if necessary to project a pattern, for instance an egg crate pattern, up on the wall behind me, which will distort the shadows and make them less obvious. Another way to reduce the effects of the harsh shadows in the background is to keep a tight shot on your subject, which basically crops out the shadows in the background. And you'll notice that's how we started this segment. Ideally, your light kit's going to have lights of different intensity, which will give you some flexibility when you're lighting a subject. The inverse square law says that if you take a light and you halve the distance between where the light was and the subject, you're not doubling the brightness. The brightness is increasing by a squared amount, which means that it is really, really getting bright. The same thing when you move the light back. If you double the distance from the light to the subject, the light brightness is now the square root of what it was, which means it falls off very, very quickly. So if all of your lights in your light kit are exactly the same brightness, you have a great deal of flexibility in how intense they are on your subject simply by adjusting the distance to and from the subject. You also have control of the height of the lights. Keep in mind that any light that creates a shadow is got to be adjusted just right. You don't want a shadow necessarily underneath my nose or underneath my chin. You may want to lower the key light so that it hits me square on. Or perhaps if you want to cast your subject in a little bit more of a villainous tone, set it up high to increase the contrast of shadows here and there, and then use the fill light to adjust the density of those shadows. But you have a lot of flexibility in how you light your subject. The 3-point lighting system is only a guideline to get started. You really have to play with the adjustment of the positions, the heights, the distance of the lights to get it right for your particular subject. One more thing to remember about lighting. Once you've set everything up the way you like it, make sure that there's not lights in the field of view or even reflections that will show up in the camera. But that means taking a step back and having a look at the scene. You may notice that I'm now a slightly different color than I was a few seconds ago. This is a great time to talk about white balance. Different lights have different color temperatures, or really different colors, but we refer to them as color temperatures. The lights in the studio here are one color, the sun's another color, incandescent lights are another, and fluorescents are another color yet. The human eye adjusts very quickly between these different temperatures as you move from room to room, but a camera needs to be told what is white light. And you do this by white balancing. White balancing is done simply by taking a white card, zooming in on it, and adjusting the manual white balance on your camera. Once your camera is told what white is, then all of your scenes will appear a more natural color for the environment, and all of your scenes will be the same from scene to scene no matter where you're shooting or what you're doing. And so every time that you change your lighting environment, you need to re-white balance your camera. Don't leave it on automatic. To do a manual white balance for your camera, you just need a white rigid piece of paper or a white balancing card like this. If you don't have a white balancing card, a piece of paper on a clipboard will do fine. Hold it near the subject that you're actually shooting so that it reflects the light that is falling on the subject. Next, zoom in on the white balance card, and you'll need to refer to your owner's manual for your camera on how to do a manual balance, but generally there's a setting and a white balance button. You hold down on that button and you'll see the color change so that this appears more white. Once that's done, you can pull back and set up the shot. Now you've told your camera what white is for the colors that are falling on your set. Okay, now we've moved outside. We're getting ready for the real shoot. A whole lot of different environmental factors have now changed. The wind's blowing, for instance. The background noise comes and goes depending whether a plane flies over or a car goes by or a dog barks. Again, some things you have control over, some things you don't. You may have to pause to wait for the plane to pass. A neighborhood barking dog, you probably can't help very much. Now that we moved out into a different lighting environment, it's a good time to remind you to re-white balance. That's something that should be done every time the light changes. Once you're outside in a production environment like this, getting ready for your shoot, it's great if you have the luxury of having someone on the set who can just help observe. Everybody gets very focused on their job. The cameraman with the f-stop and the shutter speed and the focus, and the talent on their script and lines and what needs to be covered. And sometimes somebody just needs to take a step back and say, did you realize what's in the background? Or you're squinting because you're looking into the sun. Those sort of things need to be checked, but sometimes you get carried away with particular jobs and you miss it. So when you can have somebody extra on the set just for looking around, that's a good thing. As I mentioned, we have new lighting conditions from what we saw in the studio. We are totally lit out here right now by sunlight, and actually that is being filtered through clouds. There are several different things you can do to influence the lighting when you're outside on location. First of all is that if you have a power source, you can still light the talent with ordinary set lights. Now that's good. Those set lights are possibly going to be a different temperature than what the sun is. The sun's temperature actually changes over the course of the day between low on the horizon, middle of the sky, whether it's cloudy. So even over the course of the day, you still need to white balance. But if the sun is too bright and possibly casting too many shadows, another thing that you can do is to put up a very large tent, a white screen basically, that will filter the light through, sort of like a neutral density filter, designed to bring the overall level of lighting down, but not cast any particularly harsh shadows. It will even out all the lighting and reduce the contrast, and it can be very good for the talent. This is very frequently used when you have reporters on the scene at a large event reporting over the course of the day. So let's talk about composing the shot. You've got a lot of different features out here in the outdoors that you can shoot around. Now, we chose this one because the fence and the tree and the way the branches kind of bend over make a nice little framing effect for me. Once you've got the camera set up about where you like it, it's time to talk about the rule of thirds. When you watch a television program where there's someone speaking to the camera, almost never, unless it's a very tight shot, will the person be centered in the picture. When you take a picture of a specific object, you need to keep in mind the rule of thirds, and that is where the frame is composed, your object needs to be roughly 1/3 the way over from one side and 2/3 the way over from another. Also, when you're setting up that shot, there should be just a little bit of room over your head, and you shouldn't cut somebody off at the knees. You should go all the way to the feet, unless it's a much tighter shot where you specifically are trying to crop them and focus the attention on the head. But the rule of thirds is something that you should incorporate into every shot that you get. As you can see, if you centered your subject right in the middle of the picture every time, it would get kind of boring. Now, when you're actually shooting video, you're probably watching through the little tiny viewfinder or through the pop-out display at the side of the camera, depending on what your specific model has. Something to consider whenever possible is to use a real external monitor to watch your video, to see it, to compose it. It gives you more detail, and you're more aware of some of the things that might be in the background. For instance, did you realize that you were standing on a pile of leaves, the only pile of leaves in the yard, or that there was a dead branch hanging behind you? Some of the things that you can't see when you're looking at a little bitty viewfinder 1.5 inches across, you can see if you're looking through a real 9 or 10 or 12-inch television monitor. One of the first decisions you have to make is, where do you want to put the camera? Do you want to be far back and zoomed in, or do you want to be close up and zoomed out? Or if you have changeable lenses, a wide lens up close or a zoom lens far back. It will have a different look to it that you as the director can decide how you want it to appear. All right, this is about as close as we can get with this camera and still maintain the same framing. We're zoomed pretty far out. This shot is about 15 feet back and zoomed in quite a ways. As you can see, there's a little bit of a difference in the way the shot is composed and the overall angles. Wide angles can somewhat distort an image, and far away angles can also shorten the depth of field, which we'll talk about in a second. So you as a director need to decide how you're going to compose the shot and how far away or how close you're going to be. Now let's talk about some of the functions of the camera itself. Okay. If the first rule of shooting video is always monitor the audio, then the second rule would be keep your camera on manual. It's very tempting to just turn it on automatic and start shooting, but there's nothing that will show the quality of your video to be amateurish like the focus hunting back and forth as the subject speaks, or to have the white balance change as you move from room to room. There's a lot of different functions on your camera that you really need to learn how to use to make your video look professional and to make it look good. Some of those different settings are shutter speed, aperture, white balance we've already discussed, but it's an important one, and manual focus. Now, what are the importance of these different tools? Making sure your camera is on manual focus is an important step. That keeps your camera from searching for that focus every once in a while as you maybe move your hand in front of your face. You keep it on manual, and a good way to make sure that your focus is correct is to zoom in on your subject's eyes, do a focus, and then pull back and recompose the shot. Two other important adjustments on your camera is the aperture and the shutter speed. Now, I mention these two together because they work together, somewhat inversely. Your aperture is the opening that your lens has that's allowing light into the sensor. Your shutter speed is how long each frame lasts. Now, your camera is recording at 30 frames per second. You can't change that. But what does change is in each 1/30th of a second, how long is your sensor being exposed to light. Now, the reason that these two work together is that you can adjust them to achieve specific results. But sometimes when you change one, you need to adjust the other to compensate for that adjustment. For instance, the aperture changes the depth of field. Now what that means is the shorter the number, around f2.8 for instance, you're going to have a much shorter depth of field, meaning that perhaps only about this much space is really in focus, and everything else behind me is blurry. And the larger the number, around say f18 or f22, you're going to have a very deep focus. meaning that I am going to be in focus, the tree is, and most likely all the trees behind me. Now, we don't want to get into the physics of why that works right now, but what you're doing is you're changing the opening in the lens. When you squeeze down that opening so that more things are in the depth of field, you're letting less light into the sensor. So to do that, you may need a longer exposure time for each frame. Now, stay with me. This isn't, you'll get the hang of this. So if you want a short depth of field, like only I am in focus and everything else around me is blurry, which is a very useful tool to concentrate the focus on who's talking, then you need to adjust your shutter speed to compensate for the amount of extra light you're letting in. My camera operator tells me that the f-stop, or the aperture, is set at f3.8. Now that's a pretty short depth of field, but that generally means the opening is going to be pretty wide open. So we're also shooting at 1/250th of a second shutter speed. Now we're going from wide open, or an aperture of about 1.8, to close down quite a lot, to f16. Now as you can see, the picture is going to get darker and darker and darker and darker. Now if I want that much depth of field, then what I have to do next is adjust my shutter speed. And by having a slower shutter speed, or longer time that the light is allowed to hit the sensor, it's going to get brighter again to compensate for the adjustment I made in the aperture. Now all this talk about aperture and shutter speed may seem very confusing. However, they are an important aspect of the modern day lens, and they're the same really whether it's video camera or still camera. They're very important concepts that you need to learn if you want to get to the next level of video production, because they are very powerful tools for you to use, and they are the source of common mistakes if you are not aware of how to control them. Now one last thought about adjusting your shutter speed and your aperture. Once you've gotten your depth of field the way you like it, and once you've adjusted your shutter speed to where it needs to be, or as close, you need to be aware of zebra patterns. Now, almost all cameras have the ability to show you zebra patterns. And if you don't know what they are, you can go through your menu system and find them. Make sure they're turned on. When you are composing a shot and you're adjusting your shutter speed, you'll want to see just a few zebra patterns on the brightest objects. Specifically, your camera will go through and measure the brightness that is in your frame. If there is something shiny like the bumper of a car, if someone's shirt is very bright, perhaps a white shirt, or maybe even a glare off a forehead or their glasses, if it's too bright, the camera will put this crosshatch pattern, this moving crosshatch pattern in the field of view, and you and the camera operator will see it. It won't record it, but it will alert you to let you know that you've got hot spots in your field of view. A little bit here and there are okay, but if you've got, for instance, a very shiny object right in front of you and you've got zebra patterns on it, you probably need to speed up the shutter speed to get rid of those zebra patterns, or else it's going to be a distractingly bright object. All right, we've drugged the camera out here on a cold, snowy day to illustrate the importance of the neutral density filter. Now, the neutral density filter is a filter that darkens the entire picture when you need it to be. On a snowy day like today, there's a lot of light that's being reflected back to the camera, even though it's overcast. There's going to be times when you may be shooting on a beach, on a sunny day, when the person you're speaking with has got a bright white shirt on. A lot of things that you can't control. You may want to darken the overall image so that you can maintain the flexibility with your f-stop and your shutter speed. Now, for instance, today we've actually got the neutral density filter on. When I turn it off, you can see how bright it is. Now we've got the camera set at about f2.8. That's because I wanted to have a very shallow depth of field, but when we opened the camera aperture up that much, it really let in too much light. The neutral density filter allows us to darken the whole picture and gave me the flexibility that I wanted to create the scene that I wanted. Now, if we turn it back on, you can see that everything is adjusted about right. The cameraman has adjusted it so the zebra patterns are just on the highlights of the snow, and everything else is exposed correctly. So the neutral density filter can be a great friend of yours when you're shooting outside. Now, it could be on the lens, this adjustment, or it could be a push button on the side of your camera. It could even be a menu item. You have to check with your manual to find out where your neutral density filter is. But it's a very handy tool to have. Okay, after all this talking, adjustments, and preparation, we're finally ready to record something. Now here's a few tips that you really ought to keep in mind every time you hit the record button. First of all, the camera operator should be looking to make sure the time code, the little numbers in the corner, are changing. Sometimes it's easy not to actually take it off pause, and you will do a take and realize you didn't actually record it. Now, as the person who's the talent, it's my job to keep an eye on that little red blinking light. It's called the tally lamp. And I need to look for that tally lamp each time before I record, just as a double check to make sure we're actually recording. And finally, once you've hit the record button, you want to give yourselves several seconds, maybe 5 to 10 seconds of pre-roll, meaning that the camera's just rolling and you're recording me standing here and saying nothing for a few seconds, so that when you go to edit it, you've got what are called handles on the other side. And when we get to the editing section, you'll see how important that is. And then as we get in the last 3 to 4 or 5 seconds before it's time for me to start talking, the cameraman should be doing. And it's my cue to start talking, and we're finally making the production. All right, now that you're actually recording and collecting the material that you've come to collect, I want to say something about time code. Time code is this numerical track laid out on the tape as you record. It's important not to break the time code. This means if you remove the tape from the camera will not realize where it left off, and it'll start the time code again from scratch. Also, if you rewind the tape to review some of the footage you've already shot, start recording again on some of the tape that has video, and then the camera will probably pick up the time code from there and keep going. But you don't want to have an unrecorded break in the tape, or your camera will start over. And when you go to edit, that'll be a break in the time code. Shooting interviews is one of the more common things you're likely to do. Having someone else on camera who's a subject matter expert is a great way to lend credibility to your production, whether that be a documentary or a training video. Now, in a best case scenario, you'll have 2 cameras, one on each person being interviewed, so that you're getting the questions asked as well as the person answering, and you don't have to set up between each take. But you can get away with 1 camera if you need to. Ideally, you will have a camera on the person answering the questions the entire time. It may take a little bit more planning and arrangement, but then you move the camera and shoot the interviewer asking those questions again, and then during the post-production you mix the 2 together. But what we're going to do today is I'm going to interview myself. And this is a great way to show how, even with only 1 person, which is not really a practical situation, but it shows how you, in the editing process, can really make a production look like the whole thing was shot live and presented to you completed. So, let me introduce myself. My name is Mark Duehmig again, and I'll be a subject matter expert on how to do interviews. Mr. Duehmig, thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today. Well, thank you for having me, Mark. It's good to be here. Well, let's get started talking about the interview process. You've done a lot of interviews in your day. What can you tell us as new directors and producers about how to improve our interviewing skills? Interviews are very important. They are an important tool to have in your director's toolbox. You know, doing an interview well is not rocket science. One of the problems, though, that you're facing is the fact that there are so many interviews done on television today. Everyone has seen them. Everyone knows what they're supposed to look like, and everyone kind of knows what format they're supposed to be in. So if you vary from that format very much, it's going to be noticeable, but that's okay. There's only a few things that are really important. You have to keep in mind, Mark, that if you are directing a shot and you have someone as a subject matter expert sitting in and being interviewed, that you are really responsible for their appearance. So if they sit down and their jacket is askew, or they're doing something fidgety with their hands that's very distracting, the overall interview is going to come out poorly for them. And that's really on your shoulders. You have to keep in mind that you are going to be responsible for their look, for their behavior, and for the way they come across to the visitor. So that's a big responsibility that you need to keep in mind. Now, I would think, Mark, that using different shots can get a little boring if you're just going back and forth between the person being interviewed and the talent, the subject matter expert. What can you do to vary the shots a little bit, especially if you're using two cameras? Shot changes are a great idea, Mark, and that's especially useful if you have multiple cameras running, because for instance, if I'm doing most of the talking, you can take both cameras and use them both on different compositions on the talent. And so one's a wide shot, one's a tight shot. And when you're going back and doing the editing, especially if your audio is being recorded on a separate external deck, you can switch back and forth between those multiple shots quite a lot, and it'll come out terrific because it's a way of keeping the audience interested. That's a great point to make. One of the best ways to sort of review the look that your subject matter expert has, also known as a SME, is to take your eye off the viewfinder and just look at the set. Look at the way the lights are set up. Look at the jackets and your hair on your talent. Is there a collar sticking up that they aren't going to be aware of? Is their tie askew? One of the things that I see very common with people wearing sports coats is they'll sit down and the back of their sports coat will ride up and you'll have this little wave behind their head. So once they've sat down and be comfortable, it may be necessary for someone to walk behind and just give their jacket a tug. If there are reflections on their eyeglasses, or if they have a big reflection, a white spot or bright spot on their foreheads, that's something else that you may have to adjust either with the lighting or with makeup. And we'll talk about makeup in a second, but it is important that you just take your eye away from the viewfinder and look at the set, look at the scene, and make sure that your subject matter expert is coming across well. Mark, while you're doing your pre-interview survey, one of the things that you need to pay attention to is the audio. For instance, when I was originally mic'd for this interview, I put the microphone on the inside of my lapel where it was not very visible. But because we always monitor our audio during a shoot, the sound man told me that he could hear movement of the microphone inside my jacket. So what we've done is we're going to move this to the outside, and now there shouldn't be any shirt noise, and I'll keep the wire hidden inside the jacket. That's just one more pre-interview change to make. And I'm putting it on my right lapel since I'm probably going to be almost always turned to the right and answering your questions. When talking about preparing your subject matter expert for the interview, one of the things you'll be surveying is the appearance of their skin. You're going to have people of all different skin shades be interviewed. And this is a great use of makeup to reduce glare. Now, when I talk about makeup, I'm not really referring to changing the person's appearance with the lipstick and that sort of thing, although there are times when that's appropriate. But it's great to have sort of a neutral palette of makeup available in varying shades that you can match to a person just to reduce glare, to soften the sharpness of the skin. This is especially useful when the studio area is very small, the lights really heat up the room, and you can start to get a little glisten of sweat on a forehead, and having some makeup there in place helps reduce any of the effects that could happen, that could have. So have a set of makeup in a little kit and keep that with your tools, because that's something that you're going to use pretty often. Another thing to think about is the type of clothing that you might advise your subject matter expert to arrive in. For instance, I'm wearing a dark jacket, which is nice. It can be really any color, although white and red are not the best. And it's better if it's a solid color. You don't want patterns on there, especially herringbone. They can really mess with the camera's ability to compress the video, and there's a lot of technical reasons why, but the short answer is that something like a herringbone jacket is really going to turn out ugly on screen, a lot of moire patterns. Excellent points. Now, regarding you, the interviewee, the subject matter expert, quite often the person that we're going to be interviewing is not a professional talent. Sometimes they may be, but in either case, what tips do you have for keeping the person sitting in your seat happy? What kind of things do I need to look out for to make sure that you are going to be in the best environment to be my talent, to be my subject matter expert? Making the talent happy, a subject close to my heart. Probably the biggest thing you can do to keep the talent happy is right here. Between the bright lights and the constant conversation, the nervousness, you're going to have some thirsty people on the set. Keep a constant supply of water available, and really there's nothing wrong with having a glass of water on the set. It's very natural. If the production is going to go for a while, if you're going to be there all day, then you probably need to have some food around as well. A nervous person is going to work themselves into a hunger after a few hours. We spoke about hiding some bright spots on the forehead with some makeup. Sets can get very, very warm. And when you combine that with the natural nervousness of someone who's being interviewed, you can have a very hot, uncomfortable person, especially when they're wearing a jacket, doing something to make themselves look nice. If the interview is being done in a house or an office that is normally heated to a comfortable amount, you might consider turning that heat down or turning the air conditioner up an hour or two before the interview begins. A cool room will feel comfortable under those lights. Or try to open up a window if that doesn't hurt your audio. So if you keep communicating with your talent, if you keep asking them if they're comfortable and keep the environment relaxed, it will be a comfortable environment for your subject matter expert. There are a lot of unique aspects to working in an interviewing environment for the production crew. The lighting, using the camera. I'm sure that you've expressed to your audience the importance of shooting with all of your camera settings on manual. That is especially true for an interview. When you have the camera that is focused on a small, unchanging area like the set we have here, things like a camera searching for focus, or it being slightly out of focus, or overly bright, or white balance. These are all things that are going to be especially noticeable on a closed, non-moving set like this. So you need to triple check all of your camera settings. Audio. Audio, as you know, is extremely important to any production, and it is even more so on an interview. If you have two cameras, terrific, you can have them both recording the audio. This may be an excellent opportunity to have a sound man with a remote recording device so that perhaps everything is being recorded to a digital disc or to a tape recorder or digitally right to a laptop, for instance. That is a great backup for any of the recordings that are done on the camera themselves. Or perhaps the camera is a backup to the third-party audio recording. If you look over where you're doing your interview, Mark, and your cameraman doesn't have headphones on, or your sound man doesn't have headphones on, you need to stop the shoot for a moment and make sure that they're monitoring audio. That is so important. Mark, another point I'd like to say, this is for somewhat perhaps unusual circumstances. If the interview's done over a couple of days or an afternoon, you need to make sure that there's consistency in the interview. Make sure that whatever clothing the talent wore for the first part of the interview is what he or she still has on at the end of the interview. This is especially true if you've done it over several days or you come back for a follow-up interview. If you're in a situation where you're interviewing someone in the field who, because of their job, they may be dirty or messy, perhaps you need to have a second set of clothes or second uniform available for them to change into afterwards. Or if they start off with a type of dirty uniform, that amount of dirt is consistent to the rest of the interview. Because you don't want to, you're not trying to fabricate a situation that isn't real, but you do want to try to leave out changes or things in your environment that are going to be distracting. The reason you're interviewing this person is to get the information that they have and convey it to your audience. And when you have things like changes in uniform or a uniform that goes from clean to dirty to clean, these things can be distracting and take away from the purpose of the interview itself. And that consistency mark also applies to the consistency of the set itself. We have some plants behind us. You don't want to have the plants move between different shots, between the interviewer and the interviewee. I don't know how many of your audience may have noticed that my glass at the beginning of the interview started here. We took a short break and it was refilled. Things like that are best to kept to a minimum, or the change is made slow. I probably should have topped that off before the interview began, or try to keep it out of view a little bit more so that it didn't look like the water level is going up and down with great frequency. Very minor point, but something to keep in mind, that those are distractions that you might know. Talking about the set is a great segue, because when you're just trying to decide where you're going to do the interview, there's several different factors to keep in mind. A rather simple background is a good idea. Again, you're not trying to find a background or an environment that's going to compete with the person who is being interviewed. So simple is good. Now, this white wall behind us would have been too simple, too boring, if we hadn't had some plants or something like that to break it up. Something else that you can do if you don't have the plants available is to use like an egg crate pattern or some other pattern in front of a light to project a light, or perhaps even a different color of light, up on the background to break up the shapes and patterns and make it so it's less noticeable. You also will want to try to tailor your talent's clothing to the background. I was aboard a Navy ship once where they put an officer in winter blues, which is actually a black uniform, in front of a black cloth. And when the interview was broadcast throughout the rest of the ship, it looked like a floating head and a floating pair of hands, because that's all that was visible. The uniform just disappeared into that background. So having contrast between the background and the foreground is very important too. And some of that you can control with lighting. But you also might need to be flexible with where you shoot, depending on the clothing of your talent. Boy, this is all good information. I'm learning a lot myself here today. Now, what other kind of wrap-up thoughts do you have for our audience to give them some last-minute parting advice before we let you go? Well, Mark, I guess I could only try to reiterate that you, as the director, the producer of an interview, you are responsible for how your subject matter expert comes across. Most cases, they will not have experience themselves in any type of production, and they're not going to be aware of what is important and what is not, and they're going to have that nervousness. So it's up to you to make sure that their hair's straight, that their glasses are straight and consistent, that their jacket is pulled down where it should be, that the mic isn't visible. If they're making annoying tapping noises with their finger because they're nervous, you need to put them at ease and work with them to be aware of how they're coming across. If you want them to come across in a good light, that really is your responsibility as a director. You know, one of the hardest things that I've had to deal with in some of my interviews that I've worked on has been the anxiety of the talent themselves. The subject matter experts are often not used to being interviewed on camera and can be quite nervous. There's a couple different things that you can do to help calm them down and help ease them into the whole idea of being interviewed. First of all is setting them in the chair where they're going to do the interview, or whatever location it's going to be, perhaps outside in front of a building or something like that, and visiting with them on a one-on-one basis, and try to get them to forget that they're being interviewed. Have a conversation with them. One time I was doing an interview with a lady at a manufacturing plant, and she was very, very nervous about being on camera. There's the red blinking tally light on the front of the camera. It's very useful to double check to make sure that the tape is rolling. However, it can also be an indicator to the person you're interviewing that the film is rolling. Generally, every camera will let you turn that tally light off. So what I did with this particular young lady who was very, very nervous was to turn the tally light off, set the camera rolling, and just told her that I was going to do a run-through with her, just a practice rehearsal, and ask her the questions so she could hear them and think about them. And I recorded that practice session, and she was relaxed and calm, and she said, okay, I guess I'm ready to do the interview now. And I said, you did a great job, it's a wrap. And she didn't, I didn't mean to trick her per se, but I let her realize that there was nothing to be afraid of, and we came out with a great interview from that. And one other thought about keeping your talent comfortable is putting them at ease about misspoken sentences. It's very often that someone will be saying something and they'll trip on a word, or they will want to rephrase something so it comes out better. They'll be all flustered about that because, oh my gosh, the camera's rolling. What do I do now? Well, then you have to say, relax. It's okay. This isn't a live interview. Just take a second, compose your thoughts, and start from scratch. And tell them that when you go back to edit the video, that you're going to be cutting back and forth between your questions and my answers, and it's very easy to cut out misspeaks, and that will help put them at ease very much, because it's not like if you don't get it right the first time, that's the end of it. They can make mistakes 6 times, no problem. Tape is cheap. Just take a moment, catch your breath, and rephrase the question the way you'd like it. You know, Mark, one of the questions that I'm asked occasionally is it okay if I have notes on my interview while you're interviewing me? And the answer to that is yes, it is okay. The person that you're interviewing may very well be uncomfortable in front of the camera, so notes will help put them at ease. And you could also be going into such a level of detail that it's really helpful to have notes to make sure that you're accurate and that someone doesn't misspeak, and you get all the film in the can and realize that you have to go back and reshoot something because something infactual was said. So it is okay to have notes, but there is a few tips to using them. For instance, you never want to read from the notes. They are there only to refresh your memory, and these are tips that you can give your talent while they sit down and relax and are getting ready for the interview. They're only to be referred to occasionally, and you glance at them, take a pause, and then answer the question. You don't have to read from them, and you don't have to immediately raise your head and answer the question. You can look at the notes, compose your thoughts, take a few seconds, and then answer the question, because all of that pause and the reference to the notes, that can all be taken out in the post-production, the editing. Also, advise your talent to keep the notes and the papers low. It's okay if the audience sees them. There's nothing wrong with having them, but you don't want them up here. You don't want them to be constantly seen and in the way. There's something to be kept low, and again, only just referred to every once in a while. Mr. Duehmig, thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today. It's my pleasure to have been here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Well, there are the basics on how to shoot an interview. As you can see, between the post-production techniques and the careful use of a single camera and a little bit of planning, you can get away with just about any interview. And in fact, if you had to, you could even shoot the entire interview with you and the subject matter expert in different places at different times. And the post-production techniques meshes it all together so that your viewing audience doesn't need to know. Now, that was interviews, but there's still a lot more to learn. Here's the essence of using green screen, or the technical name is called chroma key. What you're doing is creating a background with a solid color that is so distinctive that the computer is going to be able to remove that color but nothing else. So that's why we're using bright green. Needless to say, you wouldn't want to wear a green shirt to that production day. Now, what we're using here is just a green tarp that's draped over our poles and suspension system. If you're going to use this technique a lot and you have the space to dedicate to it, then what you actually might want to do is buy some green screen paint and paint a permanent wall. Now, the reason for that is that this is a nice tarp. It stows easily because we don't really use green screen all that often in our normal productions. And when it's rolled up, no matter how nicely we treat it, there's always going to be some slight imperfections in the way that it hangs from the racks. Now, why are these imperfections important? The number one rule for a successful green screen shot is that the green screen is lit very, very evenly. So there's a couple techniques that you can use to help with that. First, I want some distance between myself and the green screen behind me. And the reason for that is that I've got several lights here on the side that are projecting light onto the green screen so that the key that's lighting me doesn't cast a shadow on the green screen behind it. Or if it does cast a shadow, it's immediately behind it and the camera doesn't see it. So I've actually got 3 soft boxes around me lighting this green screen. You might even see that a shadow perhaps appears if I block some of that light. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to keep into a fairly narrow alley here that's lined up with a camera. I'm still being lit by a fairly narrow key light, and these soft boxes are able to light the background with a very soft, even light. That's going to help the computer do its job. Now, what we're shooting from here is a head-to-toe shot, and because my feet are in the camera, we've curved the green screen down and I'm actually standing on it, and that's going to allow the computer to remove everything right up to the front of my toes. If we had a longer tarp on this particular set, going out even further would probably be better. Now, once you've lit it evenly, you've gotten the video into the computer, changing the set is easy as, and now I'm here. And you don't really even have to use a place or a location, but you can also use a computer-generated background. And you can buy these online or from a number of different sources that produce nice, simple, non-distracting backgrounds that do things like allow you to put up bullet points. So for instance, let's review the important parts of shooting a chroma key background. First, you want to be able to put some separation between the talent and the background to help you light it evenly. Second, you're going to want as many soft lights as you can pouring light on the background. That's going to help erase any shadows that is caused by the lights necessary to light me. And third, if everything is lit correctly, you can put it in the computer and use the chroma key filter to knock out all of the green background, and you will have a successful chroma key. This is a fun one to try and impress clients with because it can really add some versatility to your productions. Now, when you're going to edit the green screen, here's what you're really trying to do. You're going to take all the footage that you shoot with the green in the background and lay it, say, in your second track, in the top track. And then you're going to put whatever background you want in the track underneath that, in the first track. Now, you probably know from editing that whatever you put in the uppermost track in your multi-track compositing software, that's the one that you're going to see. It's sort of on top of all the rest of them. What you're going to do is put the video of your person in front of the chroma key background in a, let's say, the second track, and then you're going to put a picture of whatever background you want them standing in front of in the first track. Then you're going to knock out this green screen using a chroma key filter. Now, once you've done that, once you've added that filter and clicked and chosen the color that you want to knock out, there may be a little tune-ups that you'll do with that filter to remove some of the edges and some of the shadows, that sort of thing. But then the person you'll be standing there with all of this green gone, you can see through that to whatever it is you have on the first track. Now, one little trick about how to place people in front of other locations. If you're going to have me standing in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, you need to look at that video ahead of time and decide how it's lit. For instance, where I'm in here in a studio being lit by a bright key of a certain temperature, that may or may not look right if you put me outside with a bright sunlight coming from over here. The shadows on my face will be different than everything else in the background, and it very well may be a different temperature. So I may be lit by a cooler light in the studio than I would be in the bright sun outside. So the lighting that I'm getting right now might be perfect for being lit, let's say, in the lobby of an office or in the lobby of a car dealership where normal office lights are lighting me. But if you want to light me outside, you may actually want to light your talent with a bright, warm light. You've gone over a lot of material now of different equipment that you might need and how to set up your office and choose your space. So hopefully you've got some different information now that you can stick your toes and get some foothold and get going on this new venture. There are a few other things on the business side of video production that we've learned that we'd like to pass on to you as well that might help you out when you're checking to make sure that you can keep the lights on. And really, a customer is not just a paying customer who's paying you to produce videos, it's also your boss in an in-house production company. So one of the things, for instance, that you might run into is customers' shock at the price that you come up with. It's very expensive to do a video production. One of the problems is it's very time consuming. It also takes a lot of equipment. We've just gone over a long laundry list of things that you really do need. And if you've come up under 10,000 or 12,000, I'd be very surprised. More likely 15 to 20,000 if you've gotten just about everything that you need right off the bat. So you have to pay for that equipment, pay for your time, and make a little bit of profit that you can buy next week's equipment with as well. So how do you justify this to the customer? Well, you need to explain it to them. You need to break out the time for them. Let them know how much time it's going to take. And don't underestimate the time it's going to take. If you try to do your estimate on a best case scenario, you will lose time. So, in my humble opinion, you need to come up with an estimate of how long it's going to take you and at least multiply it times 1.5, because things don't always work as they're supposed to, and you don't want to get the client's expectations up and then be the guy that comes in over budget and 2 weeks late. Another thing that you ought to be watchful for is how to get the money from the client. Now, the client might say, I'll pay you when the project's done, but you're going to invest a great deal of money and time into this project, and it might be a fairly significant period of time before they see the review copy and are ready to write you a check. So I advise that you get some amount of money up front, say 40%, maybe even 50% of the entire project funds up front. You start working on the project and then set other goals throughout the shoot to be paid at regular intervals. For example, by the time that you hand a nearly finished copy for the client to review, you should have about 80 to 90% of the money already in your hand. Now, once they've approved the final project and you're ready to go under duplication, then get the money for all of the duplication up front so that you don't have to carry that burden while the product is being duplicated or replicated by somebody else. One more thing to watch out for when you're out shooting are copyrights. There's fairly new litigation out there that has restricted the use of copyrights and logos and brands, and it can come back to harm you if you have included any of these copyrighted materials in your video. You can see this on many current cable television production shows, for instance, where the video camera might be filming things on the street, but the signs outside the windows are blurred out. Or perhaps they're interviewing somebody who's wearing a baseball cap with a logo on it. The logo very well may be blurred out. And the reason is that if the owner of that copyrighted logo decides for any reason whatsoever your production could be harming the value of their copyright by including it, you are the one who's going to be in trouble. So even if you just have to recall all of your videos, that in itself could be a big problem. So do what you can to avoid any copyrighted materials visible in your video. So remove them ahead of time if you can, or if one gets into your production, then you may need to blur it out or edit the scene out later to limit your own exposure. All right, another nasty subject is insurance. Now, in addition to the sizable investment you'll be making in your equipment and your office space, you've also got to realize that you're going to be putting out a product that your customers will be viewing and acting upon. Perhaps you're doing a sales video and the product that you're selling breaks or hurts them. Well, in today's litigious society, it's possible that that's going to come back and you'll be listed somewhere along the lawsuit. It's not necessarily going to happen, but you have to plan for that. So there's really two different ways that you can go about protecting yourself with insurance. One is going the bare minimum, and that is coverage of your equipment and coverage of your own liability. And $1 to $2 million liability coverage is not out of the question. And that'll also probably include some different coverage in case someone gets hurt on the set, or even someone on your property. The mailman, for instance, slips and falls on an icy sidewalk. For your own protection, that should be the bare minimum you have. Now, when you go to get coverage for your equipment, make sure you're getting replacement cost of the equipment and not a depreciated cost. Because if you buy a $10,000 camera and it's 3 years old when it gets stolen or broken, The insurance company may argue about how much they really owe you. Now, the second or the alternative method to this insurance solution is to actually go with production insurance. Now, this will be through a fairly specialized company, but there's a handful of them out there. This insurance is designed specifically to cover the unique pitfalls that can hurt a production company. So in addition to liability and equipment costs, they also have things like wardrobe costs and what happens if your production shoot is rained out for the day. Well, if you have set up a very large production with a lot of extra hands and you perhaps have got a street closed with the city and you needed permits for that day and everything's rained out and even the catering company has lost all their food and you call it quits for the day, you may have lost thousands of dollars. Well, a production insurance package will cover things like that. So you need to decide what kind of liabilities you're going to have, what kind of protections you need, and then seek out the insurance for your specific needs. I also want to talk about releases. Now, there are two main kinds of releases that we're concerned about: a model release or an actor release, and a location release. Now, the location release might be simply a permit that you have to register for ahead of time. Often parks or national monuments will require that you check in with a public affairs officer and register yourself, show proof of insurance, that sort of thing, and then you can get a release for shooting in that area and no one will bother you. The other type of release that we're concerned about is a model release or an actor release. Now, this is really a contract between you and the actor or model for the use of their imagery. It specifically will say when and where that imagery can be used and for what purpose. So for instance, if you were shooting a cola commercial and you have an actress walk down the street, you can't take that same video later and use it in, say, a condom commercial, because that sort of use could embarrass her or hurt her image that she's trying to work on. It also helps protect her for not being paid for future uses of her images. So there are quite a few different legal sample generic releases on the internet that you can find if you do a search for them. But have your legal counsel review whatever legal documents that you use to make sure that you are protected and that the model or actor are going to be protected as well. Changing the set is easy as, and now I'm here. Well, it looks like this video is a wrap. Whether you're an experienced videographer or just getting started on your first production, we've been trying to share some of the tips and tricks that we wish we would have known about when we were getting started. So thank you for taking time to sit with us today. We're sure that you found this informative, and until next time, I'm Mark Duehmig.